Hey, it's Bear Gardener, and this is a video I talked about doing for a while and went backwards and forwards on. So, first of all, cards player, content creator, find me all the stuff down below, like, follow, subscribe, all that jizz. I don't make a big deal of it, but the support from the community is the reason I do this, and this particular video is a big part of that. So, I've talked a number of times in Discord and on stream and in lots of other places actually about the concept of game balance and design, because it comes up a lot in cards. We talk endlessly, it seems, about this card is unbalanced, that card's unbalanced, and I see lots of people talking about why they think a thing is X or why they think a thing is Y. Now, to qualify my 2 pence worth, I am a veteran of multiple nerd formats and geek pastimes. I have played multiple CCGs, both online and physically, to a reasonable level. I have designed rule sets and consulted on and assisted in the design of rule sets and mechanics for tabletop RPGs and other tabletop-based shiz, both for fun and for free, but also for actual money. I am a relatively educated enthusiast of things like game theory and mathematics. So I have particular opinions that are based on my own experiences and that which I accept to be factual. However, that is also going to be relevant in this. This is going to be one of those discussions which may be a bit polarizing for some people, because some of you might get emotive about things that you don't like in the game, and I understand that. I do too. We all have them. Like cards that feel harsh or particularly bad into your deck that you prefer playing and seem to just devastate you. But as the designer, that's irrelevant. It has zero relevance. It requires zero runtime. It requires zero acknowledgement. It has no purpose. We deal in math and evidence, data. It's the Conan Doyle quote from Sherlock Holmes, which is data, data, data. I cannot make bricks without clay. You don't approach card design from the feels. You, at least not from a balance perspective. You do sometimes approach mechanical design in any sort of product from feels, in the sense that you have a theme and an idea, but then once you have that theme and that idea, when you walk into a design room, whether it be virtual or physical, the first thing we usually talk about is check your ego at the door. Just because you think it's a cool theme and your idea works on theme doesn't mean that this room is not immediately going to rip it apart and prove that it's totally unbalanced and cause you to have to go and completely rework the mechanic. Because balance and feels are two completely separate things. So I'm going to try and discuss this in cards as a context. So, history lesson, because everyone loves starting with a history lesson. How did we get to where we are with this concept of competitive games that involve a random element? It mostly goes back to the concept of wargaming. And wargaming kind of goes back to the concept of things like Go, latterly chess, which is the idea of a strategy-based game. Now, early on in design and development, strategy-based games were based on the concept that you learned strategy best on an even playing field. So games like Go and chess have what we call symmetrical and balanced design. That is to say that the game is carefully designed so that there is no hidden information, there is no random element, and both sides start balanced points of view, which is great because it makes for a very good mental exercise in learning how to process and calculate things. It's terrible from a competitive point of view for the following reason. If everything I just said is true, then if you become skilled and competent enough at the game, there is a hypothetical, actually it's not hypothetical, there is a literal point, it's just human beings can't normally get there, that you hit, at which the result of every game, that is 100% of the games without variation, is a draw. It is literally impossible to win. If you get two completely equal, fully educated, competent chess players playing a match against each other with no distractions, no external influence, and no weird random factor that's added into the game, and no time pressure, you get a draw. 100% of the time. The only time someone wins is if someone makes a mistake. So, chess is a great game for learning strategy and theory and the idea of complex interactions, movement, and counterplay, but it's a terrible competitive game. Point of view of being fun. Chess to a reasonably high level, by the way, for those who are wondering where I come to this. And the reason I stepped out of chess was when I had the realization that chess is a game that if I ever got as good as I wanted to be at it, the only thing I could ever do is play a computer to a draw endlessly. That wasn't something I wanted to invest time in. That's when I got into game theory and design and all sorts of other stuff about what you can do to make a competitive game. Right. Where do we get the concept of warfare games? And this is another thing entirely. This comes from Russian military strategy schools, bizarrely, is where the original war games come from. I think the actual original war game was named in German. And wargaming, the concept of a game in which you simulate a conflict, started as a military practice. Actual educated people who were learning to be tactical generals would be placed into isolated rooms with a map in front of them and information on their resources and troops and whatever information they would have available, hypothetically, of the enemy. The enemy was played by another general in another room. Whether that was another trainee or whether that was part of the training course depended on the circumstances. The way it worked was you would make the same decisions you would make as a general in the battle, and you would issue them. These would then be taken away by experienced commanders who would sit in a room and decide what they felt, and their experience told them the likely outcome of these orders were. Then they would feed back to the various sides of these results, and this would continue. No dice, no cards, no fixed random element, but the concept of what we got to, which we now play and enjoy, comes from this. The idea that you can test your ability against someone else with an impartial center point. Truly impartial center point, that's when we get to dice and cards, things which can randomize in a way that we don't directly influence unless we're cheating, which would defeat the object of competing. By the way, if you're interested in cheating and competition, just leave. I am not the person to talk to. This is not a video that is for you. It has nothing to do with it. I can't help you. If you consider finding a shortcut and easy way around something to be a good way of being competitive, we have a colossal difference of opinion. That's life. Nothing personal about it, but perhaps. This is going to be about the concept of competition in good spirits, because that's what I love. Right, anyway, so history lesson over, kind of. From these origins, we eventually get to tabletop wargaming and RPGs and card games and design, and Richard Garfield comes up with Magic the Gathering, and boom, we arrive here, eventually. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, because I've been talking for like nearly 10 minutes, and it's a history lesson, which, if anyone wants more of, ask. I'd be happy to do it, but there are also some really good books on it. Right. So, we arrive at the concept of a game that is played with some random element between two people. So this is where I'm going to talk about the design of competitive games and something called intentional imbalance. For a game to be competitive, as a heads-up competitive game, as a designer, you have to include intentional imbalance. As I pointed out earlier with the analogy of chess, or if you particularly want to look at it, noughts and crosses or tic-tac-toe, go watch a film called War Games. It's a beautiful summary of this entire concept. By the end of the film, your brain will go, oh yeah, that's why randomization is good. We cannot have a perfectly balanced and equal game and have it be competitive. There has to be an imbalance, whether that's just randomization or randomization with a couple of other factors. that's where your design choices come in. So let's talk about the design choices of cards. So cards chose a specific set of structures. The first thing cards chose to do, which I think was really cool, was to introduce, like, I don't know whether, by the way, these are in actual order of decision making. There's some stuff that I saw a while ago on the history and design of the game, and I think the Old Cards podcast has some stuff if you're interested to go and hear where they got from. But the idea was to add the front line, the concept of a frontal conflict zone, very similar to you would get in Warfare, and to have that become an extra plane on the board. This sort of thing has kind of been done in card games and games before, but Cards does it in a very specific way. This adds a very specific factor to the way that you play the game. Right. What else did Cards do? Cards added op cost to cards. So, in addition to the spending of your progressively increasing resources to deploy a card, you also have to use some of those resources to use that card to do things. Also kind of cool. So we're adding another variable. So then Cards decided to use 5 unit types, 2 types of effectively what I would call cantrips or spells, each of which interacts differently. So far, so cool. Right, we've got plenty of variables. Then we're dealing with a game that chooses to have 5 main factions, each of which has a specific theme and methodology, plus allied nations, each of which has a particular theme and methodology, and allow you to mix and match any main nation with either another main nation or an allied nation. And this is where we arrive at the complexity of design. Something you have to understand when you're designing and balancing a game is the level of complexity that you're dealing with. In the case of cards, this level of complexity is high, higher than most collectible or competitive card games I have ever played, because there are so many different tiers to design and balance that we have to consider things. And then, just because why not have even more levers to play with, which I fully agree with. You want levers to, I talk a lot about kind of levers and dials to play with in design. It's something as a designer we want to see. Cards has loads of them and throws in an extra one in card rarity. 4 different rarities of card. This is way more complex than you might think. So, we arrive at the eternal question of balancing cards, and X card is imbalanced. Right, let's talk about how we evaluate balance. And again, I'm going to talk in linear consideration, like provable concept. The idea of provide a premise, evidence that premise, reevaluate that premise, and do so repeatedly until you get to an integer where you feel like you have had a good evaluation. So, when we're evaluating a card in Cards, the first thing you need to do is understand context. So let's get some of the most complex context out of the way first. Because 5 main nations, even if we just take the 5 main nations, have specific themes and aims in their design, all cards are not equal between the nations. A card that is perfectly fine and balanced for a US deck might be completely imbalanced in one direction or the other. Germany. Because they do different things. There is a different pool of cards that they can combine with. This is why Cards very sensibly, in 1939, very sensibly make sure that elites specifically can only come from your main nation, because then you can dig really deep into the theme of a deck with an elite. It's great because it means that it can only happen when that's the main nation. So you don't have to worry about weird edge cases where an incredibly powerful elite can combine with another incredibly powerful elite from another nation and do something completely bonkers. Just good design. Really is. So, how would we then go about evaluating a card? Well, we start the simple way. We just literally find... Now, finding a baseline is a good place to start. And to do this, it's about time that I put something on the screen that isn't just me. Look, it's me and the collection. Right. What do I mean by a baseline? What I mean by a baseline is a point at which we can start. So I'm going to go with the most basic combination I can think of. We are only going to account for main nations. We are only going to allow standard cards. We are only going to take one cost infantry. So we have now narrowed our parameters. This is how we build a baseline. There's still a decent selection of cards here in the collection. I have all of them. Let's take a look at whether we can find some kind of basic baseline to go off. What here looks as generic as possible, and immediately we land on this. This is the 506th Airborne, which you will not see played outside of lower levels. You just won't, because it's not a particularly good card. It's also not a particularly good card. In fact, it's an entirely average card. So, this is a 1 deployment cost, 1 operation cost infantry that is 2/2. So, factual things we can say about this card. It can only take 1 action, in effect, a turn. By action, I mean move or attack. This is relevant because tanks, in particular, can both move and attack in a single turn, and thus can double spend their op cost. This card is as vanilla gets. This tells us the expected value of a 1 deployment cost infantry unit. For 1 point of deployment cost, you should expect to get 2 attack, 2 defense, 1 op cost, and a single activation. Right, now let's compare it to something. I'm going to compare it to, let's see if we can find something that is probably going to be a bit more familiar for people, because they might actually see it played on a regular basis. Let's go with 164. Right, same cost, same rarity, but it's a 1/1 with 0 op cost. And when it dies, it does something, and it has blitz, which means that it can actually be deployed and used on the same turn. So now we start to see what the value is. So the value of a reduced operation cost, blitz, and a destruction effect that gives a random +1/+1 is 1 attack and 1 defense. Because that's what this card has lost to get that. Evaluatively, this is where I would start. It's a relatively simple thing to have in my head. Now, if you're a designer, what you actually do is you put this into a spreadsheet and you use a formula which puts a value on every sub-effect of a card, and then uses a core formula which I suspect in cards, although I don't know, will be op cost versus... not op cost, sorry, will be deployment cost versus attack defense, and some formulative value of op cost, maybe 75%, I don't actually know. Hard to tell. Would give you your baseline value, and then you would apply either bonuses or multipliers, depending on the way that you want to use the mathematics in your continued curving, to each sub-ability, like Blitz. So Blitz might, for example, have a 0.25 multiplier, or a 2-point buff, or something similar depending on your evaluation system. And other abilities will have similar ones. I have not got the time to break all of this down in cards. Aside from anything else, if I really wanted it, I could just ask 1939 Games, but I don't think they give it to me because they'd be mad to do so. It's their core design, it's their intellectual property. Could I reverse engineer it? Probably, yes. But it would take an inordinate amount of time, and I'm not going to do that. So some of what I'm saying here, you're just going to have to take for granted. I do kind of know what I'm talking about. Right, so we've got one example there. Look at something similar. Now we've got 321st, which on the face of it is very similar to the 164th. It's a 1 op cost blitz infantry that has a destruction effect. But this is weird because suddenly this one has a 1 op cost. You have to pay to activate it so it actually costs 2 credits to get into the front line as opposed to 1. but it has 2 defense, so it will stick around a little bit longer. And its destruction effect adds a 1/1 to the support line. Now, on the face of it, you might look at this and say, feels a bit strong. That's a lot to get for 1 card. Like, even in comparison to our good old-fashioned baseline, this has only lost 1 point of attack to gain Blitz and a destruction effect. What this does start to tell us is gives an idea. So what we then have to do is work out whether that's actually a thing. So the first question I would ask is, every Soviet deck in the game running 321st Rifle Regiment? They're not. Spoilers. So it's not. It is not imbalanced. One of the best ways you can tell how imbalanced a card is in any card game, and it's so much easier with an online game because you have data recording, is to see the actual use and play of it. If a card is omnipresent in a deck which is constantly winning events, dominating, or being in charge, then odds are you need to look at it again. This is the advantage of mass data set versus small data set. Because we have a large player base and we can see the information, we can tell initially, this is actually pretty well balanced. I don't really value this card. Honestly, there's not cards at this that I would value at this particular cost as standard cards. Let's see, one more so that I can make my point. Let's use Jaeger Regiment, because this is an interesting one. So this is a 1 op cost, 2/1 infantry. So it's lost 1 point of defense. And it has a pincer effect, -1 op cost. So it's 1 point of defense has bought a pincer effect. Now, this is actually quite a strong card, especially early on in the game, because 0 op cost is a big thing when you consider it in mathematical evaluation. If you look at the length of a conflict, a game in this, and consider your resource expenditure, if you drop this and its pincer lasts for 3 turns on a unit that you're regularly using, it has saved you 3 credits, which has probably allowed you to deploy at least 1 additional unit. Maths matters. Still quite well balanced, because it's very fragile. If this card read 1 cost, 1 operation cost, 1 attack, 2 defense, pincer, -1 operation cost, I would consider it to be hideously unbalanced. Why, Bear? What the hell? Because this has such strong value over an extended period that extended life on it, it sticking around longer, is vastly more important than how much damage it can do. Because honestly, yes, it becomes 0 op cost itself, but you're not putting this into the front line to start dealing 2 damage. It's just going to sit in the support line most of the time because you want it to stick, because you want to get value. That is why it would be imbalanced to go the other way. Right. The same sort of thing. I'm doing one more. No, I said one more. We're going to do 1 additional one because this card is a beautiful example. Simple balance. This card does nothing complicated. It takes 1 point of defense and puts it into attack and changes nothing else. An incredibly aggressive infantry unit that nobody plays. Doesn't have blitz, so it's not a bad card. Actually, that's a lie. I would say evaluatively it's a bad card because it has no survivability, and without blitz you therefore can't get it anywhere. But my point remains. This shows a balance switch that is a piece of card that people just aren't going to play. Right. So let's change the criteria ever so slightly. Take standard away, hit limited. Nothing else. We're changing nothing else. We are only changing rarity. Yes, I still have all of them. I still have tiny gaps in my collection, mostly in specials and rares. Right, so let's look at limited. First thing that should leap in front of you, and if it isn't, I'll call it out now, is that every nation is not represented here. There are only 3 nations in the game that have limited 1-cost infantry. Only 3. And only one of them has more than 1. Japan. Aggro nation. Plays aggressive decks. This is design intentionality. Writ large in front of you. To give decks like, for example, let's ask, why does the US not get a limited 1-cost infantry unit currently? It might have had one in the past, and that's a whole thing, but I doubt it's ever had very many of them. The reason is, US is generally a mid-range value trading nation. As a result, giving it low-cost impact infantry would be unbalancing. Right. Anyway, let's take a look at some of these limited cards and see what limited gets you. Now, we don't have a single card in front of us that is a 2/2. Not one. Speaks volumes in and of itself. However, we do have a really good example of a card that I like to evaluate. This is 15th Cavalry. This is one of probably the most played cards in the game in Japan. This card is incredible value. It is a 1-cost, 2/1 with Blitz and 0 cost. Why is this card played almost constantly? Because it has everything that I was talking about earlier. It gives you the ability to get early value. This versus Meiji Regiment, which I was talking about earlier, the 1-cost, 1-op cost, 3/1 that doesn't have Blitz. This is light years better from a value perspective because you can get it into the front line or when you throw it down, and it can attack for free the next turn. 0-op cost is the thing. That's why it's only got 2 attack. Now, let's look at a similar card. This is the 118th Mixed. It's in the same nation, so we can actually side-by-side evaluate these. Same main nation. Same stats, has Blitz, same deployment cost, but gets salvage, and as a result has 1-op cost. So again, for me, this is a well-balanced card. Salvage is very powerful if used well. The fact that this can be played down to its damage and salvage is important. Note, one thing about the salvage mechanic. When a unit with salvage destroys an enemy unit on your turn, note it doesn't matter whether this unit survives or not, you can salvage it. I'm not going to get into the mechanics of salvage, but that's why this is worth making this cost 2 to use effectively rather than 1. If this had 0-op cost, it would be played constantly, because it would be ludicrous. Anyway, good example. First Airborne, unit that doesn't see a huge amount of play, but does have some value if you can get it to stick, and shows a really interesting design ethos. First Airborne is a 1-cost, 1/1 infantry. It has 4-op cost, which is ridiculous. But it's beautiful design. I like the design intent of this card because it goes to what I talk about when it comes to nation feel. This is a very British card. It is a slow burn card that in theory can have very good value. So this has Mobilize, Fury, and Smokescreen. Okay, so Fury gets to attack twice. Smokescreen keeps it on the board. We'll get to that in a minute. Mobilize, which is the heart of this, which is as long as it's uninjured and starts its turn, it gains 1/1. So next, the first turn it's still on the board, it's 2/2, then a 3/3, then a 4/4. Next, this card has the following text. The start of your turn, -1 operation cost if mobilized. So as long as this has mobilized and Smokescreen is protecting it, to get it, it's becoming a 1/1 every time. So we are waiting, in a perfect world, for this to become 0-op cost, at which point this is a 5/5 Fury infantry. For 1 credit. But you gotta wait, and it's gotta stick. It's a balanced card, doesn't see huge amounts of play, but it's interesting. And it might in future, because we're starting to see things touch on smokescreen design, but that's a whole different question. Jaeger Regiment is another interesting design, and we're hopping to another nation for a reason. We've seen what the Japan infantry are doing at this cost, which is aggression, because that's what they want Japan to be. Jaeger Regiment's weird, but interesting. Say, 1 cost, 3-1, it's quite fragile. 1 op cost, doesn't have blitz, has smokescreen, and gains ambush when it moves into the front line. Now, unfortunately, it's a little bit of a design miss because it doesn't see a lot of play, but I like the idea. The idea behind this is very mid-range Germany, which is it's an awkward ass if you can get it into the front line, but a complete waste of time if it doesn't get forward, which goes to the thematics of Germany and lightning. You think about history. Forward. Anyway, the design goes to the intent of the nation. Alright. Not going to over-batter the point, but let's hop to specials. Make sure I am missing one because I don't have the 111th Indian Regiment, but we shall take a look at these. Notably, again, all nations are not represented. Are they? Germany, US? Oh no, there is a Brit. So everyone is represented again, but in different ways. At special, what are we getting? Well, let's look at our old friend, Japan. The aggro deck. At special, Japan gets a 1-1, 1 cost, 0 op cost blitz unit. Which feels like a terrible special, until you read its text. +1 attack for each adjacent Japanese unit. Third Yokosuka does see play. Because played well, it can be crazy. It can be... So if it's got 2 adjacent Japan units, it's a 3 with 0 op cost. Himeji Regiment, only with none of the drawbacks and blitz. But it's a special. Let's look at something else. Red Devils, one of my favourite cards in the game. This card is the definition of a special card. So when I talk about special and elite cards, I will often talk about impact and force amplification. Generally speaking, from a special or elite card, I am looking for either impact, which is immediate effect on the board, big change, or force amplification. Does not always mean making you more aggressive or more attacky. What it means is driving what you do in a bigger way. Red Devils is the definition of force amplification for a frontline deck. Why? Because it is a 1 cost, 1 op cost blitz infantry that has 3 defense and has really good text. Now the 3 defense is important here. 3 is an awkward number. It means that it is just sticky enough that it's likely to hang around long enough that your opponent has to get it out the front line. Its text, which is that it costs the enemy an extra credit to target or attack it, is huge, because it makes it a terrible value proposition to remove. It lets you hold the front line long enough to get your other units into it. Force amplification. This card holds the front line while you bring power to a point. Definition of force amplification, definition of good design. The well-designed card, I consider it to be a very well-balanced and incredibly usable special. It is just good enough that it will constantly see play, but also just balanced enough that it doesn't need to be nerfed. Gebirgspioneer. This is another incredible card which I value and consider to be a force amplification card. Gebirgspioneer is a 1 cost, 1 op cost, 1-1 Alpine unit. Alpine is largely irrelevant with this. What matters with this is the text again. At the start of your turn, gain 1 additional credit. This thing sits in the support line and says to your opponent, unless you find a way to remove me, I am going to increase the speed. Remember what I said about Lightning War in Germany in the past. I'm going to increase the credits I have to execute my core strategy, which is roll forward with decent-sized offensive ability quickly every turn. Beautifully designed, it goes to theme, and again, it's just strong enough that it's good, but not strong enough that I think it actually needs nerfing. Because it's very removable. So, we talk about this, and then we can always hop to see if we've got some elite infantry. And of course, we do. Now, this is my favourite suite of cards in the game for talking about game balance. For a reason. These are what I call the 1-4 smokescreen group. There is one of these for every nation. They are all elite, and they are all insane. And they define the theme of a nation. Nakshub. Smokescreen. Gain 2 credits for the first enemy unit destroyed during your turn. Germany does credit acceleration to strengthen lightning wall. This is an incredibly strong card. In my opinion, might be just a bit too good. Signal Regiment. 0-4 smokescreen. When another friendly unit is destroyed, deal 1 damage to the enemy HQ. Japan throws lots of units forward, and this means every time you deal with the problem, you're accelerating your own loss. Man, this is strong. Really is, by the way, it wins games. Again, might be a little too strong. But it isn't elite and limited to a single nation. 329th Engineer Battalion. When a friendly unit is destroyed, your HQ gains +2 defense. This is kind of like a poor man's Signal Regiment. It has its uses, but they are not as many as you might think. This is probably the least top end of these cards. It's still, by the way, really good. 593rd Jasko. This card is way undervalued against aggro decks. It's situational because it's only good against aggro decks, but every time your HQ is damaged, reduced by 1, it's pretty strong. Doesn't get a lot of play because it's a very specific use case, so it falls, in my opinion, into the same category as the 329. Good, not silly. Right, let's get past good, not silly to just silly. 85th Pioneer Company. This card needs a nerf. I like playing Britain, I like playing control decks, I like playing order heavy decks, and I am saying this because that's what this video is about. I'm actually going to look at a card and go, this card actually needs a nerf. It is too strong. Blood. It's the usual thing for the 1-cost, 4-op cost smokescreen gubbins. Fine. Your orders cost 1 less credit to a minimum of 1. Too good. Reduce the cost of your first order in a turn by 2 to a minimum of 0. Or something similar. Would be really strong. This is bonkers. Very, very powerful. I personally think it is just a bit too powerful, hence my suggestion that it might need a nerf. Now that's personal opinion. I'm not a designer, I have no control over this, but in this video, if I don't call out things like this, I'm missing the point. By comparison to its fellows, which we have just looked at, this is insanely good. That is the definition of balancing it out. It strengthens the nation's ability too much. I am accounting for the fact that this is only available to Britain, but the thing is, Britain is so order heavy that this is really powerful. Anyway, this gives us a rough idea of where we go. Right, so because everybody's probably been waiting for this, let's go to a hot button card. Everybody loves a hot button card. I need to go to 5-cost British Infantry. Hello, the Glamour Boys. Right, let's talk about this card, because I think this card is an excellent exercise in balance from the other side. This card violently needs a nerf. It's already had one and it was terrible. Sorry, 1939. Dropping its health down to 6 was nowhere near enough. Didn't address the actual issue with the card. Right, prove your point there, because you talk about this. So let's do so. we're only going to deal in standard cards. We're only going to deal in standard cards that have guard, because that is the heart of what this is. Right, there are 3 5-cost guard units in the game. Just 3. Let us compare those cards. 5-cost, 1-op cost Japan Guard. Now, we account for the fact that Japan isn't super fond of guards, so it's kind of okay for a Japan Guard to be a little bit strong. This is a really strong guard. 4 attack, 7 defense. The op cost is largely irrelevant because you want it to sit in the back line for the 5 cost. This is actually a really good baseline to work from. This is very strong. I would suggest that in the case of other nations that are more defensive, you would want to see the attack value going down substantially. Right. Infantry Regiment 13. Now, this card is an amplifying card, but critically, this card is also the first card we have looked at that is a non-core nation. Right, into design again, because you're going to love this. If you've gotten this far into the video, you're clearly enjoying this, at least I hope so. The rules for allied nations are different by definition. Allied nations can afford to have substantially stronger cards in their card pool. Why? Because you are limited to only being able to include 12 of them. They can't have elites. And they can therefore dig into specific themes. This is a 2-4 guard. You're never going to deploy this as a 2-4. So what would we need to get this to a similar level to, say, the Osaka Regiment? So when we talked about the Osaka Regiment, I said that other nations that are slightly more defensive, Finland would definitely fit into the more defensive category, a very defensive theme to Finland, should probably have slightly less attack. Or slightly altered stats. So this gets +1/+1 for each enemy unit. I would assume that this card is at value, that is to say at parity, when your opponent has at least 2 units on the board. With 2 units on the board, this is a 4/6. 1 point of defense short of the Osaka Regiment, which is an important point of defense because it leaves it in range of things like hammer, and in 2-card average trade value, not 3-card average trade value. That is the number of things you'd have to likely attack it with on average attack value to remove it. Still really strong. Arguably, also, may need a little bit of a nerf, but it doesn't see enough play that I'm overly worried by it. But it's an interesting card. Right, so we've looked at these 2. Now, I want to look at a more expensive guard. In fact, all the more expensive guards. I want to look at something like, for example, let's go with this, because this is an incredibly strong card. The Mobilized Regiment from France is a 4/5 guard with Mobilize. We know how good Mobilize is, and guard. When this unit loses Mobilize, you fully repair your units, which of course you can see the cycle that goes here. This is really strong. 6 cost, and still nowhere near as good as these chaps. Why then? Because of the card. I do not care about the deployment cost. I don't care about the operation cost because it's guard. The stats don't bother me. What bothers me is the deployment effect. This is a great value guard. So if we shunt this down to British guards, but also include every rarity in the game, we can look at something like the Grenadier Guards, 5/9, 6 cost, which is a really good guard, or Blackwatch, 2/6, Fury Guard. What does an enemy have? These are good cards. These are good cards and specials. I forget to point this out because I always assume it's obvious. These are specials. You can only run 2 of them. I would consider these to be of about the same value as Glamour Boys. Grandia Guards is just trade on a stick. You're going to have to trade out so hard unless you've got removal. And Black Watch is moderate trade value. Fury really doesn't matter. And has a really powerful text effect that slows your opponent's enemy orders down, but that is situational enough not to be broken. Glamour Boys has a similarly powerful. When you deploy it, you give your HQ +4 defense. Now, Britain, for those of you who don't know, is largely about outlasting your opponent. Thus, any card in a British deck that gives you +4 HQ defense is good. Glamour Boys, objectively, is vastly outvaluing any other standard card at its value or above its value. Punching so far above its weight, it's a joke. It outvalues basically limited guards. If you look at limited guards, we punt out these. Glamour Boys, in my opinion, is vastly stronger than the Reamer. Some adjacent as mobilized. I mean, it's a thing, but it doesn't work. It doesn't see a lot of play. 260th Guards Rifle. I'm sure you can veteran it, which lets you veteran other units, but man, that's situational. 7th Alpini. Damage dealt by this unit adds a defense to your HQ. So the first time it does damage, this, by the way, is adding 4 defense to your HQ. It's limited and situational because it might not even trigger, and it's still really strong, and it will still see play. In fact, we saw it used at the OCC by the person who won it. Glamour Boys is definitely in this league, if not above it. So, without wittering on endlessly, this is a 45+ minute video anyway, let's get to an actual conclusion, because conclusions are the point of this stuff, right? This was not meant to be a definitive coverage of every card in the game. That would take me many, many hours and bore you to death. This was meant to be a video that illustrates the way that I, someone with design experience, looks at balancing of cards and what I'm looking for to balance them. As ever, I hope it's useful. I hope it's interesting. If it is, let me know. If you want to see more, talk more about it, please let me know. I don't know, we do a live stream where I talk about design and card balance, and people can throw cards at me and say, what do you think of this, and how would you evaluate it? Maybe that'd be a fun thing to do. I don't know. The only way I'm going to know is if you tell me. So use the comments, message me on Discord. My inbox is open. Message me on any of my other social media channels. At me on Discord. Whatever you fancy. I'm always open to talk to people about stuff. As always, hope you find it useful. Take care of yourselves. Be good humans. And I will see you for the next video.